G'day friends, it's Andrew here from Nature's Image Photography, and today I'm going to be doing a tutorial in my front garden all about macro photography. If you're new to the channel, before we get started, I'd love it if you hit that subscribe button so that you can stay in touch with what comes next. As long as this shutdown period continues, I'll be looking for new ways to present my photography knowledge. So if you subscribe to the channel, you'll be able to stay in touch with what's on the way. Now, I'm going to be looking at macro photography because right now there's not a lot else I can be doing. A lot of what I've done lately has been macro because as a nature photographer, right now I can't easily go to the beach, I can't go to the rainforest, I can't go and catch up with friends to practice my photography out in the field. But one thing I can do is macro because for this sort of photography you don't need exotic environments. If you've got a garden, if you've got a few flowers, you'll probably have some bugs, and there'll be something you can find to photograph. So macro photography is very accessible, but it's also very challenging. So in this tutorial I'm going to look at some of the challenges, and then we're going to discuss how we might be able to deal with them. Now, the couple of main factors that I want to talk about regarding macro are the things that make it so difficult. The first one is the absolute lack of depth of field. Our theory tells us that the closer you get to the subject, the shallower the depth of field becomes. And that's why it's easy if you get fairly close to a person or a bird to have your subject in focus and your background out of focus. But with macro photography, you can get so close to the subject, you're taking your photos sometimes from this far away, the depth of field will become so shallow you can't get an entire ant in focus. You've got to be very specific about what you focus on, because you might get the head of the ant in focus but the back end out of focus. You don't want it the other way around. So depth of field is very tight, and that makes it very challenging. The other thing is camera movement. When you're taking photographs where the entire picture might be framed up on an area this big and your main subject might be this big, it only takes the tiniest bit of camera shake to completely ruin your photograph. So the techniques I'm going to be talking about today are aimed at overcoming those couple of things, and I'm going to be looking at two main methods. One is taking photos on the tripod, and the other one is taking photos handheld, and you do need quite different approaches depending on the subject, the light, and various factors, but we'll have a look at both, and you can decide which ones work best for you and your home environment while you're out practicing your own macro photography. So the first method I want to talk about is handheld photography, but before we get started on that, I'll just quickly talk about the equipment I'm using. This is my Pentax K3 Mark II, which is my older DSLR camera, and I've got the Tamron 90mm f2.8 macro lens on. For those of you who follow the channel who might be wondering what's happened to my Panasonic Lumix G9, that's the camera I'm using to shoot this video. So the Lumix is over there. This is the camera I'm using to take the photos. Now, the lens is important. The whole point of having a macro lens is it can get you up close and personal to the subject. You might have more powerful telephoto lenses that are great for portraits and wildlife and that sort of thing, but a lot of those are limited in the autofocus, in the focus, to only being able to take photos up to 50 centimeters or 100 centimeters away from the subject. The whole point of a macro lens is it can get right up close to the subject. That's what they're for. They usually double quite nicely as portrait lenses too, which is handy. But this lens can take photos quite sharply from maybe this far away from the camera. So you get right up close and personal to the subject, but it's getting so close that creates those problems that I mentioned before, the camera shake and the depth of field. Now let's have a look at both of those. If you're taking photos handheld, and sometimes you have to take your photos handheld because you're following moving subjects from flower to flower and that sort of thing, you need that mobility that you don't have with a tripod. If you're taking your photos handheld, you have to eliminate camera shake, and the only way to do it is a fast shutter speed, and I mean really fast. You probably know with something like landscape photography, you might be able to take photographs at a 60th of a second or 125th of a second and get away with it, because even if there is a tiny bit of camera shake, it'll barely impact on your photograph. But with macro photography, that same camera shake will make a big difference. So you really need your shutter speeds to be fast, and I'm talking 1,000th of a second or faster. You might get away with a 500th of a second, but really I prefer to be over 1,000th of a second if I can, in order to eliminate that camera shake. Now let's have a look at the settings here. You probably understand why I prefer to use 200 ISO if I can. So the camera's set to 200 ISO at the moment. It's an f2.8 lens, so I've got the aperture wide. And when I set the shutter speed until the light meter's in the right spot, that brings me to a 400th of a second. Now, a 400th of a second in other photography is usually fast enough, but for what I'm after here, it's really not fast enough. Now, the aperture's already as wide as it'll go, so if I want to go faster, I have to put the ISO up. Let's put it up to 800, and now I'm getting my shutter speed to about a 1200th of a second. So I'm happy with that. The shutter speed should be fast enough. But remember, I'm at f2.8, and that means minimal depth of field. And in the macro terms, that means on a flower this big, I'm only going to have a fraction of that flower in focus because the depth of field is going to be so tiny. If I want to increase the depth of field, I need to make the aperture smaller. If I make the aperture smaller, let's put it down to f8. I've got to slow my shutter speed down to compensate for that, and it brings me back to about where I was before. The shutter speed's too slow. So the problem I'm having with the handheld photographs is I pretty much have to put the ISO up, and if I want to have the aperture any smaller, I have to slow my shutter speed down. So for practical purposes, I really have to keep the aperture wide, and that means a minimal depth of field. This is one of the facts of life. With handheld macro photography, your depth of field is going to be tiny. It's just something we learn to live with. So it does mean on a flower like this, I can't reasonably expect to get the entire flower in focus. I'm only going to get a bit of it. So it becomes fairly critical to make sure you get the part of the subject in focus that matters most, and just live with the fact that a lot of your subject will be out of focus. Now, let's look at the actual focus. Now, I've got a few options here, but one thing that's very difficult with macro photography, and remember again, we're talking handheld, so there's no tripod here, is focusing on something, and if you've got to wait for a moment, like there's a bee on the flower and you're waiting for it to turn around and be in a good position for a photograph. If you focus, and then you ask yourself, how long can you stand over this subject and not move 1 millimeter? The answer is not very long. And that's really what you've got to do, because the difference between in focus and out of focus is a millimeter. So if you move, if the subject moves, if you move even the tiniest bit, your picture's going to be out of focus. Now, it can be really hard to stand here for any length of time. But watch what I'm going to do instead. I'm using one-shot focus, which means I've put my finger on the focus button and I hold it down and the focus stays locked. So I can focus, and I'm pretty happy with the way the focus is. Now, if I'm waiting for a bee to turn around and face me, I can now, with my finger on the button, I can stand up, rest my shoulders, relax and just watch the bee, not even necessarily looking through the viewfinder, and just wait till I think my moment's about right. And then I've got my finger on the button, so the focus hasn't changed. I can just come in, and in that moment when things come sharp, I can focus. Now that's using the single shot focus. A lot of people would find it easier just to switch their camera over to manual focus, because then you don't have to actually refocus each time. So I can, again, get my focus to where I'm pretty happy with it. And then, if I don't touch this again, the focus won't change. So now I can stand back, I can relax, I can take a few breaths, rest my shoulders, stand back and then move in on the subject and shoot when the time's right. You can do the same thing with back button focus too, but most more experienced photographers who use back button focus will already know what that's about, so I won't go into that in any great depth. So there's a couple of tips for keeping the photograph sharp. Eliminating camera shake really requires a very fast shutter speed, and that really means you're going to have the aperture wide and you're going to have a very shallow depth of field. You're probably also going to, unless it's a bright sunny day, you're probably also going to have to put the ISO up, which means sacrificing a little bit of image quality. But those are the realities when you're doing handheld macro photography in the shade. So that's the handheld side of things. Next, we're going to look at how I do this using a tripod and see how the tripod helps us to overcome some of those challenges. There's one other tip I would like to share with you that can help you overcome the lack of depth of field factor in macro photography, and probably more handy if you're taking your photos handheld rather than using a tripod. And it comes back to the theory. The theory says the closer we get to the subject, the shallower the depth of field becomes. Now, the biggest problem you have with macro photography is usually that the depth of field is too shallow. Now, as we've already said, in order to increase the depth of field, we have to slow the shutter speed down in order to be able to close the aperture, and that doesn't always work for handheld photography. There is another way though, and it's not a settings thing, it's more of a common sense thing. If the biggest issue you have is that the closer you get to the subject, the shallower the depth of field becomes, sometimes it just makes sense to get a little bit further back. Instead of taking a photograph where you fill the frame with your subject from this far away, maybe sometimes it's a better idea to just come further back and take your photograph from this far away. You'll naturally get more depth of field because the further you get from the subject, the stronger the depth of field becomes. And it'll also mean you'll end up with a photograph that probably requires a bit of cropping. But if I take my photograph from back here with a stronger depth of field and crop it, sometimes that'll produce a better photograph than if I take my photograph from way down here and there's just no way in the world I can get the depth of field I want. So don't be tempted to always go as close as you possibly can to the subject. Sometimes it just makes a little bit more sense to get further back. Take a photograph that needs a bit of cropping, but you know it's sharp in all the right places, rather than taking a photograph where you know the depth of field is going to be too shallow before you even press the button. My other approach to macro photography, and this is by far my preferred approach, is to use a tripod. Now, the tripod obviously eliminates camera shake right off the bat, so that issue's gone. And that creates a lot of freedom in the settings you can use. Now, if you're using a tripod, you no longer have to worry about using a super fast shutter speed to eliminate camera shake. You can slow the shutter speed right down. And if your shutter speed's lower, then you're able to bring the ISO down, you can make the aperture smaller, and you've got a lot more freedom to use the settings you want to use. So if you're taking photos handheld, you're pretty much stuck with using the settings you have to use. But if you're taking photos on a tripod, you can use the settings you want to use. Now, here I'm pointed at this flower. I've got the camera on a tripod, and now instead of shooting at a higher ISO, I've put the ISO back to 200, and at f2.8, I can take this photograph at about an 800th of a second. It's quite bright daylight at the moment, but that's at f2.8, and that's going to give me a minimal depth of field. It's a fairly big flower, I'm still fairly close to the subject. Now, because I'm not having to worry about camera shake, I can close the aperture down. If I put the aperture down to f8, that'll give me a little bit more depth of field. It means I've got to slow my shutter speed down to 125th of a second. Now, I couldn't do that handheld, but with a tripod I can do that quite successfully. Now, also using a tripod, I thoroughly recommend using a remote release of some kind. You can use the 2-second delay, but a remote release allows me to take the photograph without pressing the button. So instead of taking my picture like this and causing the camera to wobble, I can take my photograph like this. And I've got a really nice shot there, which I'll show you at the end. Now, I can go further. I can take my aperture down to, let's say, f16. That means slowing my shutter speed down to a 40th of a second. Now, really, there's no way I could have taken this photograph handheld. With a tripod, it's easy because it's just a matter of doing that. I've got my shot, there's no camera movement, and I've got a lot more depth of field. So the tripod makes things possible that would be virtually impossible if I wasn't using it, if I was taking my photos handheld. I can now use pretty much any settings I like. Now, this of course is assuming that there's not a bee buzzing around on the flower that I have to follow the movement. It's not windy, the flower's nice and still. So I can take this photograph quite successfully. That's why sometimes you have no choice but to take the camera off the tripod and use your camera handheld. But if at all possible, I thoroughly recommend, even though it takes more trouble and more effort, some people don't like tripods because they can be a bit of a nuisance, but in the macro world, you're going to find that it makes your life so much easier, and not only easier, but your photographs will be better. I think it's safe to say that almost every macro photograph I've taken over the years on a tripod has been better than most of the macro photographs I've taken handheld, simply because I can use any settings I like instead of having to always go with the wide open aperture and the super fast shutter speed, which is what I normally need when I'm taking my photographs handheld. Now, once again with the tripod, you have the option of using autofocus and manual focus. You can really use both, but because the camera is on a tripod and you've got time to work on your subject, I usually prefer to go to manual focus, because then I can really fine-tune exactly where I want to focus, and it's easy once you've chosen your spot to not only focus but keep it focused, because the camera's not moving, and when this little bit of wind stops blowing, the subject's not moving either. So you can use autofocus, but then it becomes difficult sometimes to get the focus to lock on to exactly the point where you want it to. With manual focus, you can fine-tune your focus right to where you need it to be, and then when the wind stops blowing and your moment's right, you're ready to press the button and take your photograph. I thoroughly recommend, as I said before, if you have a tripod and it's not windy and the subject is not moving around, like you're not chasing bees buzzing around on a whole bunch of flowers, if you've got the tripod, the effort you take will well and truly be reflected in the quality of the photographs that you end up with. Okay, so there are my tips on macro photography for today. Thank you for joining me in my garden. It's hardly what you'd call a comprehensive course in macro, but there's a few tips in there which I hope you'll find useful. Certainly if you're a beginner, you're going to find macro very challenging, but of course that's what makes it so rewarding when you start seeing some good results. I do hope some of these tips will help you get some better quality, sharper shots. Now, I have spent a fair bit of my last week in the garden doing a bit of macro photography in among these flowers pretty much every day. So to finish the video, I'm going to show you some of the pictures I've taken, and I'll show you the settings too, so you can see how the ideas I've talked about come to life in real photographs. And if you've enjoyed the video, before you go, please don't forget to subscribe. I've always got more coming up on YouTube in my world of photography, and if you subscribe, it really is the best way to keep in touch. For now, I'm Andrew Goodall. This is Nature's Image Photography. Thanks for watching.